And Isaac's servants dug in the valley, and they found there a well of living waters. And the shepherds of Gerar quarreled with Isaac's shepherds, saying, "The water is ours." So he named the well Esek, because they had contended with him. And they dug another well, and they quarreled about it also. So he named it Sitnah. And he moved away from there, and he dug another well, and they did not quarrel over it. So he named it Rehoboth. And he said, "Now the Lord has made room for us, and we will be fruitful in the land." In 1951, my parents left Yemen with nearly 50,000 other Jews during a mass exodus. They were running away from their homes in a land that became too hostile toward the Zionist project in Palestine. But they also believed it was a sign that the Messiah had come. And they walked for a year across the Arabian desert, following an invisible path back to their ancestral home. But my father, who was then 7, had to walk, while my mother was 5 years old, rode in a basket strapped into a donkey. The little they did not leave behind was stolen from them along the way. But they kept going, propelled by their faith in ancient stories. They arrived in Israel to a harsh reality: wooden shacks, 9 people in a room, no running water, low labor wages, and constant wars. Though there was no evidence of messianic arrival, they continued to believe in the miracle of their return, 2,500 years later, to the land of their forefathers and foremothers. During early years after the founding of the state, Jews emigrated from over 80 countries and from several ethnic groups, forging a new Israeli identity. The phenomenon of kibbutz galuyot, the ingathering of the exiles, was clear already in my elementary school. All 40 of the children in my class were immigrants or children of immigrants from more than 20 countries, as varied as Argentina, Canada, the Dominican Republic, Egypt, France, Germany, Hungary, India, Iran, Iraq, Italy, Morocco, Poland, Romania, Russia, the United States, and Yemen. So despite Israel's many integration problems, we all shared this feeling that this was our communal home, a long-lost family reuniting. My familiar experience of migration during the early years of Israeli independence, my rabbinic background in Jewish text, and my interfaith work with Project Genesis have led me to propose a possible theological solution to the Israeli-Palestinian crisis. I believe that a religious journey is one in which one moves from a narrow to an expansive and diverse place, from darkness to light, from depression to hope. In biblical thought, the paradigm of narrowness is embodied by Egypt, Mitzrayim, the site of the Israelite slavery, but also the canal of their birth as a nation. Mitzrayim is the Hebrew word of narrow. And at the same time, it's the word for enemy. It means that the essence of enemy is narrowness. In contrast, the narrative of Isaac's well at Rehoboth provides us with a paradigm of expansiveness. When Isaac digs his 3rd well and is successfully able to avoid strife with the Philistines, he named that well Rehoboth and declares, "Now the Lord has made room for us, and we will be fruitful in the land." The medieval rabbi Nachmanides addresses this paradigm of expansiveness with reference to building the 3rd temple. As we know, the 3rd temple is a key premise of Jewish messianism, or the believing in the Messiah. He compares it to the very place that is one of the 2 points of orientation in this proposal, Rehoboth. Nachmanides writes in his commentary on Genesis 26:22, and he called the third dwell Rehoboth, wide open spaces. And this one alludes to the Holy Temple, which will one day be built. And that one will be built without fighting or conflict. Then God will widen our boundaries. As it says, when the Lord your God will widen your boundaries, as he swore to your forefathers in Deuteronomy 19:8, which speaks of the future time and of the third temple. It is written that the chambers will be built into become wider as they wound about higher and higher. And that's from Ezekiel 41:7. And we will be fruitful in the land, from Genesis 26:22, when all the nations will worship him, God, shoulder to shoulder. And that's from Zephaniah 3:9. The principle of coexistence is that the land is ample and enough for 2 people to dwell in it simultaneously, within 2 states, each reflecting the national and religious character of its inhabitants. But before we agree on the 2-state solution, we must not neglect the identity, the 2 nations, and to take into account their deep-seated religious beliefs. In our case, in the heart of the 2 nations, Israel and Palestine, we can find the descendants of Isaac and the descendants of Ishmael. The descendants of Isaac are mainly Jewish, while the descendants of Ishmael are mainly Muslim. Therefore, in order for the 2-state solution to work, and for the 2 nations to live truly in peace, we need to adopt the language of 2-nation solution first. Only then political borders would make sense and can be finalized. Coming under the Israeli sovereignty in the aftermath of the Six-Day War in 1967, Temple Mount continues to be a core source of contention between Israelis and Palestinians and the greater Muslim world. The reason is the existence of the Dome of the Rock on the same spot where the first and second temples once stood. More importantly, the messianic aspiration includes building a third temple, presumably on the same spot. A political sovereignty in 1967, which now can be translated into a religious sovereignty, has aroused the concerns of Palestinian Muslims and the greater Muslim world, who worship at the 2 mosques on Temple Mount. The conflict is around the idea that the Dome of the Rock was built on top of the Holy of Holies of the temple. Even though being the heart of the matter and the reflection of the peace process as a whole, conversations regarding Temple Mount seem to always lead into a dead end, or at least a very narrow end. In recent years, as I've been leading interfaith pilgrimages to Israel and seeing the land through different prisms, new angles have been revealed to me. More and more, I see the land in its fullness and in its great potential of becoming the Holy Land many have sought to conquer. All those who conquered it by force caused unlimited pain and suffering to themselves and to others, eventually were pushed by the next conqueror. What if there's a way to prevent the next war, and perhaps the war of wars? In the pursuit of peace between Israelis and Palestinians, and as part of the effort to move from narrow into expansive place, and to affirm that ample space exists in the land for both peoples, Project Genesis proposes a creative solution that both respects the existence in perpetuity of Al-Aqsa and the Dome of the Rock mosques, and at the same time seeks to the realization of building of the third temple. Last year, on our pilgrimage, I asked our guide, a Christian, Arab, Palestinian, Egyptian, Coptic deacon, a question about the rebuilding of the temple. Do Muslims have a problem with Jews building a temple in general, do you think, I asked him? Or is it a question of the location of the temple? Our guide immediately replied that it was the problem of location. I then asked, what if the people of Israel gave up their aspiration to build the third temple specifically on the Temple Mount and continued to worship in the Kotel Plaza, in the Western Wall Plaza? He jumped up and said with light in his eyes, world peace. It was the way he said it that lit a small light at the end of the tunnel. As I call it, the light of the light in the guide's eyes felt like a little light at the end of the subway tunnel. As I called it, that for years I was waiting for the subway in New York, sometimes late, sometimes hot and sweaty. That time taught me that to spot the first glimpse of light when it finally appears around the corner. Project Genesis hopes to supply a novel idea, or chidush, to Nachmanides' teachings about the third temple that would be built without fighting or conflict. The wide open space that becomes the site of the third temple is already an area of Jewish worship, the Kotel Western Wall Plaza. With the Kotel as the site of the third temple, the potential conflict over the prospect of building the third temple, the Jewish third temple, where the previous two temples stood, dissolves. The biblical story of Isaac in Genesis 26 and the commentary of Nachmanides form the foundation of our vision. Our vision conceives of a movement of the mind so we can all keep our permanence. In Judaism, once something has been acquired and held for a considerable period of time, it acquires a permanence that is conveyed through the principle of chazakah, or stronghold. According to this principle, the existence of the two mosques on the Temple Mount is secure in perpetuity. On one level, a well represents the Torah and the spiritual well-being of the people who possess it. But a well also signifies sovereignty, political sovereignty. Originally, Isaac dug wells that his father dug, but he learned that he must dig his own well. He is not his father. This is the reason he repeats the phrase, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Just as each patriarch had to find his own way to God, each generation has to possess the land on its own. Our generation needs a fresh view. Perhaps the view that Jews are not alone in the religious desert anymore. While the Jewish journey begins in Egypt, the narrow place, it must not end there. It has to end in Rehoboth, the wide space. For us, the metaphor becomes reality, an example and paradigm for all. The journey to the wide place, moving from narrowness to wideness and diversity, when all the nations will worship him shoulder to shoulder, is a journey for all, not a Jewish journey alone. Among the diverse religions in Israel, there exists Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. Furthermore, in his work, the Yad Chazakah of Maimonides, in Hilchot Melachim, the laws of establishment of kingship, teaches us that Christianity and Islam usher the way of the Messiah. The rationale rests in the fact that the Bible, with its prophets, rabbis, and history, teaches us that it's not the walls that matter most, but the meeting, the tent of meeting. After all, the first sanctuary was simply a tent, as God dwells in our hearts. V'shachanti betocham. God tells us it's about meeting other people and praying together. God dwells in our hearts. Therefore, the rabbis mandate us to find ways to constantly expand and widen the tent of meeting. Notably, the Torah doesn't specify a place for an ultimate house of God, to tell us that the house of God is not a specified place, but a place of inspiration. Wherever we pray, if we set our hearts towards Jerusalem, Jerusalem comes to us. Thus, any place of worship becomes holy, whether in a synagogue or at home. The place becomes hamakom, the place, another name for God Himself. What matters is not the location, but the holy space we ourselves create. In Deuteronomy, the Torah speaks 16 times between chapter 11 and chapter 16 about the place which the Lord will show or will choose. God intentionally does not yet reveal the location of His intended sanctuary. As God's instruction to Abraham of Lech Lecha, go one step at a time to the place I'll show you. A beautiful midrash explains where God ultimately decides to place His Holy of Holies. It speaks of two brothers who received equal share of inheritance from their father. One had a family and one did not. They each thought of their brother and thought of the other needs and greater part of their, that they would need a greater part of the inheritance. Then they each went to give to the other. And the place they met on the road, the two brothers met each other, became the spot of the Holy of Holies. To further make the point, when King David wants to build the temple for God, God conveys back a message to him and tells him through the prophet, go and tell my servant David, thus saith the Lord, should you build me a house for me to dwell in? For I have not dwelt in a house since the day that I brought up the children of Israel out of Egypt, even to this day, but have walked in a tent and in a tabernacle, in all places wherein I have walked among all the children of Israel. Spoke I word with any of the tribes of Israel, whom I commanded to feed my people Israel, saying, why have you not built me a house of cedar? In 2 Samuel 7. Our proposal does not ignore the historical location of the Jewish temple on Temple Mount, and hopes that one day we can all share the Holy of Holies. But identifying the Kotel Plaza, the Western Wall Plaza, as the site of the Third Temple is consistent with the vision of peace and worshiping shoulder to shoulder. In short, no one needs to move from where they live or worship in order to have a peaceful resolution. I was surprised to find out in meetings with top politicians in Israel that in preparation for this proposal, that they were not including any of religious aspects in the negotiations for 25 years since Oslo. Religion was not part of peace process by design. They say, why bring up problems? Well, perhaps the religion is the problem, or religions are the problems, but they're also the solution. Empires came and went through the millennia, but the three faiths have been here over thousands of years. In the process, many holy sites for one religion became holy to another. As our forefather Isaac moved from the first and second wells to the third, so have we, and just 100 meters from where we believe the original spot was. Nobody needs to move anymore. At this point, we all have chazakah, a stronghold on the land, denoting acquisition through stronghold. And this is the basis for all three religions' holy sites. Metaphorically, Egypt, in its narrowness, represents a strictly hierarchical and vertical structure, a horse and a rider. But what God wanted in the Song of the Sea was to drown that mindset. We must move to the horizontal. No one is above another. One next to each other, shoulder to shoulder. For many years, taking the subway in New York City, I was fascinated by the ability of so many people of infinite diversity to sit quietly together, totally accepting each other, even if only for a brief time, perhaps just one stop. There must be some sort of subway wisdom there, I thought. What is it that allows us, the Muslims and the Christians, the blacks and the white, the gays and the straight, just to get along in the subway, that we haven't yet learned above ground? Can sharing holy lands be similar to that? Can we simply sit together for a little while, pretending not to look at each other, but seeing that we may not be that different, that we may all just want to arrive peacefully at our destination? When the subway doors close, make it a holy place. A few minutes later, the doors will open and another group will be tested. Will they pass the challenge of the subway wisdom? Perhaps we can look at our lives here on earth as a short subway ride and not waste our time on conflict. During Sukkot of 2017, Project Genesis hosted an interfaith panel discussion at the Orient Congregational Church. Dr. Donald Russo and I hosted Sheikh Ghassan Menasra in a unique opportunity to have a Jewish, Christian, and Muslim dialogue. The main purpose of the discussion was to present our respective views of sharing holy sites and spaces in the Holy Land and elsewhere. In a world that too often opts for division, we wanted to offer an alternative of sharing. The reality is that many holy sites change hands over the millennia and are holy sites to all religions in the same area. They can become spiritual cities of refuge, while all can congregate. While Dr. Russo spoke about the idea that often we are addicted to certainty, and thus we are not open to a real conversation and real growth, Sheikh Ghassan spoke about the need for each faith to learn the code of the other, the red buttons we should respect. I spoke about the pizza model I learned at an interfaith evening at Tantur Center in Jerusalem the year before, when I met Sheikh Ghassan at the Abrahamic reunion. The pizza model simply says that whether you belong to the Jewish slice, the Christian slice, or the Muslim slice, as you move toward the front or to the center, you become closer with people of the other faiths. I added that since Judaism works in concentric circles, we can then make an additional circle around the middle and create a separate category of those who want to come more and more towards the center of the pie. The existence of interfaith dialogue can achieve the ultimate will of God, as articulated by Isaiah and the foreigners who joined with the Lord to serve him and to love the same of the Lord, to be his servants, everyone who observes the Sabbath from profaning it and who hold fast to my covenant. I will bring them to my holy mount, and I will cause them to rejoice in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices shall be acceptable upon my altar. For my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples.